a brother, and he says that all bishops are bald on top. And I told him, you were not. He said it would be a miracle if you were not. So would you take off your little hat and show him that you are not bald? May I tell you, little man, that the difference is this: all of the other bishops had mothers who told them that they would all come out on top. I have more problems than they do. They don't have the problem of whether to part their hair in the middle. The subject of this telecast is how to think. First of all, how to think about statistics and figures and graphs. Secondly, how to think about new ideas. First of all, how to think about statistics. There are two kinds of reasoning, or two general ways of thinking. Now here we're getting very deep, but it will only last for a second. You can turn off to another program while I explain this, then come back. It'll be over briefly. One way of reasoning is called deduction, and that is from the universal to the particular. For example, all men are mortal, John is a man, therefore John is mortal. And the other reasoning, from which there come graphs and statistics, is induction. Induction is from the particular to the general or the universal. Now, one of the reasons why we have to use this particular kind of reason is because we would never know certain conclusions unless we made an investigation. That's one of the reasons we have to have statistics. For example, suppose you wanted to answer such questions as these. Is marmalade stickier than jam? Well, you have to use induction and go around and stick your finger in marmalade and jam. Or this problem. Do babies with blue booties cry louder than babies with pink booties? Which do men prefer, nightshirts or pajamas? That's the question you would have to investigate. You never could find it out by deduction. Now these inductions can be complete when you investigate all of the cases and all of the samples, or they can be incomplete. There are very few that are actually complete. For example, a mother has 4 children, 3 of them in the room. She says, "Where is Gwendolyn?" As soon as she gets the answer, she has complete induction. She's made an investigation of the location of all of her children. Now, incomplete induction means that you cannot investigate all cases, so you take some samples and investigate a few. From these, you get statistics, you get graphs. I want to tell you about a graph picture that I have hanging in my office, and I have it hanging there in order that I will never take graphs and statistics too seriously. I want you to take a look at it. The title of it is The Fund for the Poor of the World. And the 12 months are at the top. And the line, the graph, is very, very low. In fact, the fund is low until you get to the month of June. And then in June, it skyrockets and then comes down again very low the rest of the year. I am seated at a desk answering a telephone, and I'm saying to someone, looking at the graph, let's see now. Last year, I was away in June. That's when everything went up. Suppose now we wanted to make some statistical finding about how many youths in America under 21 years of age said their prayers. How could we do it? Well, One method, we might telephone them and say, are you saying your prayers? And then secondly, we might hide a camera in the bedroom and take a picture of them. And thirdly, we might also ask them to keep a diary and write down every time they said their prayers. Suppose now I gave you a statistic. Suppose I investigated the number that said their prayers, or I said that I did, and I gave you this answer. That 12.3% of the youths of America under 21 years of age say their prayers. Now, you'd be very much impressed with that, wouldn't you? Because there's that 3%. You would say, my, that must be scientific. That 12.3, that was one of the great advantages, incidentally, of the Ivory Soap advertisement. Ivory Soap, 99 and 44, 100% pure. And you would say to yourself, my goodness, if Ivory Soap admitted that there's 56 100ths of 1% impurity, that must be good soap. It was the fraction that got you. All right, now suppose I said that, 12.3. Now I'm going to tell you how we might arrive at that conclusion. Suppose I investigate. Cannot investigate all of the youth in America. Suppose I phone 600 of them, from which I got 12.3. Now I'm going to give you some rules or statistics. And notice how they're going to be worked out. Whenever you hear a statistic, always ask these questions. 1, how many possible cases are there? That is to say, how many cases could be tested? 2, how many were tested? 3, can you believe what they told you? That was the problem Kinzig had. Did everybody tell Kinzig the truth? Not on your life. You can't be sure if you call up the boys and say, did you say your prayers? Did they said their prayers? And 4th, if it comes from an independent laboratory, who paid for the experiment? If cigarette X blows much better smoke rings than cigarette Y, who paid for that investigation? The independent laboratory isn't in business with their health, you know. Now, keeping this in mind, suppose we investigated 600. How many boys and girls are there in the United States under 21 years of age? 60,160,000. You think that's a pretty good test? How many are we getting? We're getting 6 out of every 1,600. Work that out in percentages. What percentage of the youth of the country are we testing? Now get this. I'm not finished yet. Of 1%. You see, I'm a rapid calculator. Did you ever hear about the rapid calculator? It was a man who was on a train. Somebody behind him said 648 cows as they passed by one field, 1,238 cows, 78 cows. The individual was curious. He said, how do you count them so fast with this train going this way? He said, I'm a rapid calculator. And he said, I count the legs, divide by 4. If I investigated 600 cases out of the 60 million, I've only sampled 0.0000099% of the cases. How much is it worth? Nothing. Nothing from the point of view of reason. Remember, in 1936, the Literary Digest sampled 10 million people, and after sampling 10 million people as to how they would vote, they concluded that the electoral votes in November of that year would be 370 for Landon and 161 for Roosevelt. And they consulted 10 million. What do you suppose we're going to get if we consult 600 or 800? Did Landon become president? Anybody got an old Landon button just to remind us of these things? Another sample. Some years ago, Johns Hopkins University admitted women to the university. The following year, I was reading in a work on statistics, figure was given out that 33 1/3% of the women who attended Johns Hopkins University married professors. That was a marvelous opportunity for young women going to a university. They would have a choice of all of these learned men. All right, what are the laws of figures? 1, how many cases were possible? 2, how many were investigated? So we asked, how many students were there at Johns Hopkins? Women, 3. How many married a professor? 1. So if you want to think clearly, always find out how many cases were possible before you believe a statistic. Now here's one statistic that you can take from me that is absolutely reliable. And it's worth remembering. 50% of all of the married people in the United States are women. The other 50 are men. Now, another way to think is never completely follow a mood. See, there are styles in thinking just as there are styles in women's clothes. I once saw a man running like mad with a hat box in his hand. I said, "What are you running for?" He said, "I'm trying to get the hat home before it gets out of style." Well, there are fashions in thinking, too. And the fashions in thinking are made by scientists. For example, we've had 3 styles. We had biology, was a very popular science at one time, and then physics, and then psychology. In 1859, when Darwin published his Origin of Species, and not scientists now, but popularizers, lyricizers, romanticizers, those who felt that art and literature and everything else should dance to the tune piped for it by a science, made everything evolve. For example, Grant Allen wrote about the evolution of God, evolution of marriage by Westermarck, creative evolution by Bergson, which the whole cosmos was evolving. I used to attend lectures at the University of Paris. Bergson was there teaching, and he was very popular, you see, because he had romanticized this. It was the mood and fashion to talk of evolution in those days. And you had to go sit through a dull, stale, flat, unprofitable lecture on mathematics in order to save your seat for Bergson's lecture. And all of the fashionable dames of Paris and London were there. You'd find outside of the Collège de France, you'd find automobiles, Rolls-Royce, Chanard Walkiers, Hispanis, Suizo, Renaults, and all the fine machines. I remember one day coming out of the class of Bergson, some English lady spoke to me. She says, "Wasn't that a wonderful lecture?" I said, "What did he say?" And so she told me something that he didn't say, and I spoke to her in French. She didn't understand a word of French, but Bergson was wonderful. So it was the fashion. Then that fashion died. And then when Einstein developed his theory of relativity, then we got a whole group of lyricizers here who said that everything is relative to space-time. And then we got relativity of morals, relativity of law. And then we got a new kind of literature in which we were constantly getting back to new beginnings. Remember Gertrude Stein, a rose is a rose, is a rose, is a rose, is a rose. And Professor Alfred North Whitehead of Harvard said that God is a creature whose matrix is space-time. It was just the popular thing to do, to talk about space-time. And then that ceased to be popular, and then we got into the domain of psychology. And when Freud, as a scientist, published his work in which he developed the importance of the subconsciousness, which was indeed a great scientific contribution. There immediately cropped up here those who made everything dance to the tune of psychology. Then you got juvenile delinquency explained away as an Oedipus complex. God was called a father complex. Then you got a new style of literature. Notice today the short stories don't end, they just stop. There are no characters in literature like there were in the Victorian era, characters with an ethical simplicity like Micawber or Uriah Heep. They're disconnected, like pearls in the string of which is broken. And one is interested only today in the psychology of everything. That's because it happens to be a mood. Now the point is this: one cannot take, and to think well, remember that you cannot take the methods and the conclusions of one science and apply them indiscriminately to another science. Each science has its own object, its own method, and it is entitled to that method. But you cannot take biology and apply it to engineering. You cannot take the subject of a sentence and apply it to another sentence. Take for example this sentence here. Mathilde is artistic. And now take the sentence, the piggy, Porky, is fat enough to kill. Now can you take the predicate artistic and apply it to this sentence here and say Porgy is artistic? Can you take this, Porgy is fat enough to kill, and apply it to Mathilde? Well, neither can you take the conclusions of one science simply because there's evolution of the biological order doesn't follow that God is evolving, that marriage is evolving, that everything else is evolving. When, for example, you have with the palm of your hand, you do not call in a florist. You break the key in your door, you do not call in a piano tuner. Something happens to your windpipe, you don't call in a plumber. If you want to discover the authenticity of a Rembrandt, you don't call in the Lord Chancellor. He's a specialist in law, but he's not necessarily a specialist in art. And therefore, every particular science has its own domain, its own method. And a good thinker will not allow the methods and the categories and the theories to overflow into other domains. And furthermore, it's always a good thing to remember that if you marry the mood or the spirit of an age, you will be a widow in the next one. These fashions simply do not last. And it is not to be said that if one does not follow each of these fashions, that one is behind the times. No, one is behind the scenes. He sees the theories that were popular years ago will be forgotten in 10 or 15 years, but we've got to have some principles that do not change to live by. Who today knows Herbert Spencer? How many books of Herbert Spencer are taken out of the public libraries of the United States? Yet everybody read Spencer 50 years ago. Nobody knows him today. That's going to be true of the same ones who create the mood of this hour. Therefore, to think well, one has to have principles that are independent of space and time, by which one can live. We know that these principles exist, and we know there's such a thing as truth, simply because there's a logos, there's an intelligence behind the universe. One of the great thrills of thinking is to know all the sides. but also to know what is right and what is true. Why, it's a romance very much, as Chesterton says, like driving a chariot. 6 wild horses, driving them down a mountain lane road. And on either side of this mountain road, there's a ravine here, precipice here, chasm here, and a pit here. And the thrill of following truth is to drive those horses straight down that line. Oh, it's the easiest thing in all the world to be a rightist, for example, in politics. All you got to do is tumble over. The easiest thing in the world to be a leftist, just fall over. Let go. It was the easiest thing in the world to be an Aryan in the 4th or 5th century. Easiest thing in the world to tumble into some mood today. Very easy to be a communist, just as simple as falling off a log. Very easy to be a Nazi. All you got to do is fall into the other side. And so the great romance of truth, therefore, consists in hewing to this straight line, knowing the pitfalls, and driving the horses of truth directly, and seeing all of these errors and moods, prostrate and fallen and forgotten, but driving ahead, really, but erect. That's the romance of thinking. That's the joy of truth.
People of all faiths recognized Bishop Fulton J. Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life. His unique ability at being natural and at ease in front of any audience was noted early in his ministry. He was ordained in 1919 and went on to become one of the best-known and greatly loved priests in church history. He wrote 96 books and hundreds of articles and columns. He broadcast numerous radio and TV programs. People from all faiths watched him on television because he spoke to every man. They always waited with joy for his goodbye, his blessing, God love you. It continues to give us joy and memories.
Bye now, and God love you.
Confessions for children. He said, I didn't have any sins. I had to wait for some. Some lumberjacks in Canada decided to go to confession. They had not been there in a few years. So they sent the bravest of them all in first. And he said, Father, I've committed every sin a man can commit. Well, did you ever commit murder? No, he said, that's right. That's one sin I never committed. Well, you see, you have not examined your conscience properly. Go outside the box and examine your conscience, then come back. So as he stepped out of the box, he saw the long line of lumberjacks outside. He said, no use tonight, boys, just hearing murder cases. And I was hearing confessions once. A little boy came in, and among the other things, he said, I threw peanuts into the swamp. I didn't pay any attention to it because I didn't think I knew my theology well enough to understand all of those sins. And another boy came in, and among other things, I pushed peanuts into the swamp. And I heard that 10 or 12 times. And the next boy came in, and I said, I suppose you pushed peanuts into the swamp. No, he said, I'm peanuts. You liked that one, didn't you? Well, we can't be telling you stories all day. So we must get to the older children. And may I begin by telling you that we are living in about the first age in the history of the world that has denied guilt and sin. Everyone today believes he's immaculately conceived. There are no sinners. We're just patients, but we're not penitents. Interesting it is that Carl Menninger of the Menninger Institute of Psychiatry in Kansas has just written a book saying, what has happened to sin? Curious that as the moral theologians and our catechisms drop the idea of sin, a psychiatrist is reminding us that there is sin. He, for example, has said that the theologians gave up sin and then the lawyers took it up, and sin became a crime. And then the legalists gave it up, psychiatrists picked it up, and then it became a complex. Now, sin is a reality in the world, and we have to face it, for we are all sinners, everyone. As a matter of fact, we cannot begin to receive the mercy of God until we recognize that we are sinners. Now, what happens when we repress guilt and sin? And we do that. Men sin and they pay no attention to it. Same with women. Well, it has a tremendous effect on our mind and sometimes on our body when we do not bring our sins to the surface and confess them to the good Lord. You have heard of transplants in medicine, a kidney transplant, a heart transplant. And you've often read, too, that the transplant was not effective, or the heart transplant was not effective. Why? Because the body resisted it. There are antibodies in our organism that will not assimilate and take hold of a new organism. Now, our soul is that way. It has antibodies. And when any sin gets into the soul, then we're disturbed. Mind is unhappy. It's very much like having a broken bone. The bone hurts. Why? Because the bone is not where it ought to be. And when our conscience is not where it ought to be, then we suffer. We have a disturbance of conscience. We're uneasy. We may try to cover it up by drink and amusement and so forth. But in moments of quiet, the guilt is there. Recall some of the effects of guilt as portrayed for us by Shakespeare. Now just think of it. Shakespeare was born in 1564. I hope that was it. That's coming out of my subconsciousness. Don't look it up. But I think that I was in second-year college. I learned that Shakespeare was born in 1564 and died in 1616. Well, in any case, what is important is the fact that hundreds of years before we had psychiatry, he tells of a complex, a psychosis in the mind of Macbeth, and a neurosis in the mind of Lady Macbeth. Now, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth had contrived to kill the king in order to seize the throne. After the murder, Macbeth always seems to see a knife before him. He said, "What is this I see before me?" "A knife with the handle toward my hand?" There was no knife. This was a psychosis. This was the way the guilt was coming out. Lady Macbeth She washed her hands every quarter of an hour. She saw blood on the hands. And she asked, are not all the waters of the 7 seas enough to wash this blood incarnadine from my hands? There was no blood on her hands. This was the effect on her mind of the suppression of guilt. A woman once came to me about her brother. She said, he's been going to doctors for about 4 or 5 years, and he is no better. His weight has gone down to 90 pounds. And would you see him? And I said, if his trouble is mental, I cannot help him. He belongs with the psychiatrist. If, however, there is a moral basis for his condition, then I can help him. The man came. He weighed about 90 pounds, frail, fearful. And I said, talk to me for a half hour. I will not interrupt you. He talked for about 40 minutes. And I said, how much money did you steal? He said, I didn't steal. I said, how much was it? He said, I resent that. I am no thief. I did not steal. How much was it? He said, $3,000. He said, how did you know I stole? I said, I didn't know you stole. Well, why did you ask me? Well, I said, as you talked, you told me that whenever you put money in the collection box, you always wiped it off first. And I thought perhaps you had dirty money. Yes, he said he had stolen $3,000. Well, we made arrangements to pay it back, and his health picked up. This was the guilt on his soul. Just think, my dear ladies, of how many mentally disturbed women we are going to have in the United States in the next 10 or 15 years when the guilt of abortion begins to attack the mind and soul. For the present, they justify it on the grounds that everyone is doing it, and it's only scar tissue anyway. As one doctor said to a girl who came in and said, well, it's only a little scar tissue. Would you remember it? Would you dismember it? And the doctor said, what did you intend to call the scar tissue? So in years from now, the guilt will come out in a peculiar way. Though at present, there may not be any. The guilt may not manifest itself at once. That is very evident in the course of the life of King David. David was one day on the top of his palace in the penthouse, and he looked across the street and he saw a woman on the adjoining penthouse, Bathsheba. And he asked Bathsheba to come over and see his etchings. And he loved Bathsheba, not wisely but too well, and she's found with child. The husband, Uriah, was away at war. David called him back. As king, he could do that. And he said, go home to your wife. He said, no, I'm at war. We're not allowed to be with a wife when we're fighting. David then got him drunk. Said, go home. He slept at David's front door. David was trying to blame the paternity onto the husband. So finally, finding that he couldn't get rid of him that way, he said to the general, put him in the front lines. Men have to die in battle. Maybe Uriah will be killed. Uriah was killed. It didn't bother David in the least. Until about 7 or 8 months after, the prophet Nathan came to him. And he said, Nathan, I have a problem. He said, David, I have a problem. And you as king must settle it. There was a poor man who had one tiny little ewe lamb. Next door to this poor man lived a rich man who stole the poor lamb and made a banquet for his rich friends. And David immediately became interested in social justice. David said, "This shall not be. He shall pay with his life, and the property shall be restored fourfold." And Nathan said, "Thou art the man. You took the ewe lamb of Uriah, and you killed that ewe lamb." The ewe lamb was Bethsabe, I mean. "And you have taken this lamb away from the husband." And that was the moment when David sat down and wrote the famous Psalm 50. "Have mercy on me, O Lord, have mercy on me." Or I think it's maybe 51 in the New Scriptures. You see, sometimes, now not always, but sometimes we can cover up our want of individual justice by a great love of social justice. Remember when Judas was at the banquet room of Simon? The woman came in and poured ointment on the feet of our blessed Lord. Judas said, "Why this waste? Why not give this money to the poor?" Well, you can imagine Judas going on making an attack against our blessed Lord, saying, for example, "I heard you on the Mount of Beatitudes say, 'Blessed are the poor.' Where's your love of the poor now? Have you forgotten all of those people that are living on hanging shacks in the road between Jericho and Jerusalem? Remember the days when we walked through the inner city of Jerusalem? Have you no interest in those poor? Look at these humble fishermen shacks here at Capernaum. Where's your love of the poor?" Our Lord said, "Judas, you have the poor with you always. Me not always." Was Judas interested in the poor? No. He was robbing the apostolic purse. And that's the way he covered it up. So when we suppress our guilt, it is there for eternity, unless it is forgiven. When it's forgiven, it's completely blotted out. Well, how do we now, through the mercy of God and the fullness of faith in Christ, how are our sins forgiven? By confession. What is confession? Nudity. Nudity of the soul. Stripping ourselves of all false excuses and shams and pretenses, and revealing ourselves as we really are. Do you know, my good people, that as we have given up examination of conscience and confession, that nudity increases in the world, physical nudity? Let us study it for a moment. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were naked, but not ashamed. Why? Because they were covered with the aura of God's grace. It, as it were, shone round about them, robed in glory. And hence there was no sense at all of nakedness. After they fell, they perceived themselves to be naked. Why? They lost the grace of God. And then they had to be clothed. Now, I could give you, and I wish we had time, but I'm not going to do it, to tell you how their nakedness was covered up and to explain the mystery of it. Do you know how their nakedness was covered? Yes, fig leaves, I know, but they wilted. Their shame was revealed. How was it covered up? God made for them the skins of animals. God did something. It was done vicariously. An animal was killed, not them. And thirdly, it involved the shedding of blood. And I could take you all through the Old Testament and unfolding that story. But the point is that they were naked and ashamed because they'd lost the grace of God. In our modern world, we're bringing back nudity, trying to get back into the Garden of Eden without walking up the hill of Calvary.